On the morning of November 6, 1956, the British Empire ended with a phone call, not a battle, not a treaty. A phone call. Britain's army was winning on the ground in Egypt. Within hours, it would surrender anyway, because Washington had just found a weapon far worse than a bomb. To understand that phone call, you need to understand a canal. The Suez Canal opened in 1869, a 100-mile cut through the Egyptian desert, linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Before it existed, a ship sailing from London to Bombay went all the way around Africa. That's a trip of over 12,000 miles. The canal cut it nearly in half. By the 1950s, 2/3 of Europe's oil moved through that single waterway. And here's the detail that matters. Britain didn't just use the canal, it owned a piece of it. In 1875, Egypt's ruler was drowning in debt and put his shares up for sale. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli borrowed £4 million from the Rothschild banking family without asking Parliament and bought them on the spot. From that day on, Britain treated the canal as British property and stationed troops along its banks to prove it. Enter Gamal Abdel Nasser. He wasn't born into power. His father worked in a post office. But in 1952, Nasser and a group of young officers overthrew Egypt's king in a nearly bloodless coup, and by 1954 he was running the country. He wanted something huge, the Aswan High Dam, a massive project to control the Nile and power Egypt's future. The US and Britain agreed to help fund it. Then, on July 19, 1956, without warning, Washington pulled the offer. London followed within hours. It was meant to humiliate him. It did the opposite. 1 week later, on July 26th, Nasser stood before a crowd in Alexandria and spoke for over 2 hours. Midway through, he said one specific name out loud, the French engineer who'd built the canal a century before. It sounded like a passing reference. It was actually a signal. The second he said it, Egyptian officials moved to seize every canal installation, live, while he was still talking. By the time Nasser stopped speaking, the Suez Canal belonged to Egypt. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden received the news at a dinner party. He didn't sleep on it. He compared Nasser to Mussolini within days and decided the man had to go. There was just one problem. The world in 1956 wasn't the world of 1875. Gunboat diplomacy was dead. Eden couldn't just invade. So he built a plan that hid the truth from almost everyone, including his own closest ally. There's something else going on with Eden that rarely makes it into the history books. 3 years earlier, he'd survived a botched surgery that left him in chronic pain and reliant on strong medication just to function. Colleagues at the time described him as exhausted, erratic, sleeping only a few hours a night. The man steering Britain through one of the most dangerous decisions of the Cold War wasn't operating at full strength. That matters because every choice he made from here on out came from a leader running on fumes. In late October 1956, officials from Britain, France, and Israel met secretly at a villa outside Paris. Israel's side included Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and future leaders Moshe Dayan and Shimon Peres. Over 3 days, they wrote a plan so cynical it's almost funny to say out loud. Step 1. Israel invades Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Step 2. Britain and France intervene as neutral peacekeepers, demanding both sides withdraw from the canal. Step 3. Egypt refuses because the canal is Egyptian territory. Step 4. Britain and France invade, take the canal, and remove Nasser. It was choreographed days in advance, on paper, with signatures. Eden was so afraid the document would leak. He ordered every British copy destroyed. The French refused, the Israelis kept theirs too. Each side had its own motive. Israel was cut off from shipping and under attack from Egyptian backed raids for them. This was survival. France was fighting a brutal war in Algeria, and Nasser was arming the rebels. For Britain, it was simpler and older. The canal was the empire's lifeline, and they weren't ready to let it go. Nobody at that villa seriously planned for how Washington would react. Eden was so nervous about the plan leaking that he refused to put his own signature on the document. He let his foreign secretary sign for him, keeping just enough distance to deny it later if he had to. That oversight is about to cost Britain everything. On October 29th, right on schedule, Israel invaded the Sinai. The next day, Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Egypt refused, exactly as predicted. On October 31st, British and French planes started bombing Egyptian airfields. Nasser had one card left to play, and he played it fast. Egyptian forces scuttled roughly 40 ships in the canal itself, blocking it completely. The prize everyone was fighting over was now unusable to anyone. In Washington, President Eisenhower found out from the news wires. Not from London, his own allies hadn't told him. He was furious, and he had reasons that went beyond friendship. It was election week in America. He was trying to win trust across a decolonizing world, in India, in Indonesia, across Africa. And here were his two closest allies, running a colonial war behind his back. Eisenhower wasn't the only one applying pressure. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent messages to London and Paris, threatening rocket strikes if the invasion didn't stop. Historians still debate how seriously to take that threat, but it added urgency to Eisenhower's thinking. The last thing he wanted was for a colonial squabble over a canal to hand Moscow an opening in the Middle East. Still, Eisenhower didn't send warships. He didn't threaten troops. He reached for something quieter and far more lethal: the dollar. Here's why that weapon worked. Britain had won the Second World War, but the bill nearly broke it. It owed billions in wartime debt, much of it to the United States. Its currency, the pound sterling, was propped up by gold and dollar reserves that sat at roughly $2 billion going into the crisis, barely enough to cover a few months of imports. It looked solid from the outside. It was a house of cards. The moment the bombing started, investors panicked and started dumping pounds. In October alone, Britain's reserves fell by $84 million. Then it got worse. In November, the single worst month, they fell by $279 million, pushing Britain's reserves right down toward the floor the government had promised never to cross. Chancellor Harold Macmillan had originally pushed for the invasion. Now he was staring at numbers that terrified him. He asked the IMF for $561 million to defend the pound. He asked the U.S. Export-Import Bank for $600 million more in credit. Washington's answer was the same every time: not until the troops come home. That was strike one. Strike two. The U.S. Treasury quietly signaled it was prepared to sell off its own holdings of British government bonds, a move that could crash the pound entirely on purpose in public. Britain's biggest wartime ally was aiming a weapon at Britain's own currency. Feel the weight of that for a second. A nuclear-armed empire with the world's second largest navy brought to the edge, not by an enemy, but by an ally holding its debt. On the morning of November 6th, the same day Eisenhower won re-election in a landslide, Macmillan told Eden the truth. At this rate of loss, Britain wouldn't be able to buy food or fuel within weeks. It wasn't ceasefire or victory anymore. It was ceasefire or bankruptcy. Eden called Eisenhower that day. The call was short and reportedly deeply uncomfortable. British and French troops were, at that exact moment, advancing down the canal. Commanders on the ground believed they could take the whole thing within 24 hours. The order came from London anyway: stop. The ceasefire took effect at midnight. The entire military operation had lasted less than 48 hours of actual combat. A United Nations peacekeeping force, the first of its kind in history, arrived in the Canal Zone in mid-November. British troops were fully withdrawn by December 22nd. Only then did Washington release the money it had been withholding all along. Eden's political career didn't survive the fallout. He resigned as Prime Minister on January 9, 1957, officially for health reasons. He was replaced by Harold Macmillan, the same man who had pushed for the invasion, then pulled the ceasefire lever when the numbers turned against him. In January of 1957, Eisenhower unveiled what became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, a formal pledge of American military and economic backing for any Middle Eastern nation resisting Soviet pressure. Translation: the job Britain used to do in that region now belonged to the United States. The fallout didn't stop with Britain. France drew the opposite lesson. Rather than accept permanent dependence on Washington, French leaders spent the next decade building an independent nuclear arsenal and pulling out of NATO Joint Command, determined never again to be this exposed to an ally's leverage. Egypt got the opposite outcome. The canal reopened to shipping in the spring of 1957, cleared and run by Egyptian engineers who Britain and France had insisted couldn't manage it alone. Nasser, meanwhile, became a hero across the Arab world, a leader who'd faced down 3 armies and kept his canal. Here's your echo back to the hook. British soldiers had more firepower, more experience, and more ground taken than Egypt could match. They still lost, because by 1956, the thing that decided outcomes between great powers wasn't tanks anymore. It was dollar reserves. Eisenhower didn't need to fire a single shot at British forces. He just needed to threaten to sell some bonds. That's why historians point to this one week in November 1956 as the moment the British Empire, in practical terms, stopped being an empire. Everything that came after decades of decolonization was just paperwork on a decision already made. If you want to see this exact playbook used again, decades later, watch what the U.S. did with sanctions and frozen assets during the Cold War in Latin America. Same weapon, different decade. Subscribe if you want more of these. The moments where history didn't turn on a battlefield. It turned on a balance sheet.